Good afternoon and welcome to our first Australian market update of 2025. I'm your host for today, Nicole Consterdine, Recruitment Consultant here at People to People in our Melbourne office. On today's show, would mandatory reporting lead to an inclusive workforce in 2025? This week, we're joined by Peter Bacon, CEO of Disability Employment Australia, to discuss whether mandatory disability employment and pay gap reporting in Australia is the right step forward in 2025. We'll explore how these measures could foster a more inclusive workforce, the potential benefits and risks of greater transparency, and why some may be hesitant to embrace these changes. Also on today's show, 𝐝𝐶's latest report reveals the busiest months to apply for jobs across different industries. We'll highlight our latest job opportunities across Australia and share how you can take the next step in your career. And finally, we'll unveil our latest social media insights on changing work week, asking, is the 4-day model gaining momentum again in 2025? So jumping straight into today's show, the latest data from the SDAC released in July 2024 revealed a staggering 93% of unemployed people with disabilities aged 15 to 64 face difficulties in finding work. Among them, 1 in 10 reported experiencing discrimination or being treated unfairly due to their disability. These barriers highlight ongoing systematic challenges in the job market, including the lack of transparency in hiring and career progression. So, how does this lack of transparency impact career opportunities for people with disabilities? To explore this further, we're joined by Peter Bacon, CEO of Disability Employment Australia. Peter, thanks for being with us today.
No problem. Glad to be here, Nicole.
Good. So to start with, can you tell us a little bit about Disability Employment Australia and the work that your organisation does?
Yeah, so we're the peak body that represents providers of disability employment services primarily. We exist with the purpose of unlocking the economic potential of people with disability who live in Australia. And to that end, we do a lot of kind of government advocacy and policy work, but we also do practical work to help the sector and make sure that we're moving forward and helping as many people with disabilities to secure sustainable jobs as possible.
Great. Yeah, such an important topic. It always has been, but I'm glad that it feels like it's getting some more momentum at the moment. So how does the current disability employment landscape in Australia affect career progression and opportunities for people with disabilities?
Yeah, so you mentioned before the survey of disability aging and carers, which is the first time that we've had the data, new data around disability employment in 6 years. So it's a really good time to actually reflect on where we're at and where we need to go. So the good news is that actually we've, in that sort of 6-year period, we've come forward a long way. So the unemployment rate for people with disability was over 10% in 2018. It's now below 7.5%, which, you know, is still too high, especially when you compare it to the, I think it's still under 4% that people without disability or the general population has, but that's a significant reduction, as well as that the economic participation rate for people with disability has gone up from around about 52% to over 60%. So lots of things are moving in the right direction. And there's all sorts of reasons that we can talk about as to why that might have happened, of which I think the increase in flexible working would be one, and another one would be the increased comfort people have disclosing. But clearly we still have a long way to go if we want to get Australia to where we want it to be when it comes to people with disability and employment. The fact that the disability employment gap is still pretty significant, and the fact that frankly there's hundreds of thousands of people out there who have tremendous capability and potential to be part of the labour market, but aren't currently, is a major miss. And when you talk about the tight sort of recruitment market that we've got at the moment, and you go to, oh, well, how are we going to do that? How are we going to sort of address that tightness? Well, things like migration are one thing, but if we have a sort of homemade stock of people who are ready to go and do great things, that for me would be one of the first ports of call. So that's kind of where we are as a landscape. And one of the things that we think about quite a lot is, well, what are the government's policy settings and where they're taking us to, and what are they enabling in terms of changing that sort of picture, so we don't have gaps which are significant as that, particularly for people with sort of moderate and severe disabilities. So looking at those policy settings at the moment, there are certain things that we're actually doing quite well. Disability Employment Service every year helps tens of thousands of people into work each year. Not every country has that. As well as that, the NDIS, okay, there are definitely some issues there and things that are being addressed, but at its core, it's funding for people with disability to be more independent. So that's a really good thing too. What we've seen less effort, and I think where much of the conversation today will be around, is on the what I would call the demand side. So what are we doing to get employers involved with disability employment? What are the policy settings we're putting in place? What is the support that we're putting in place? Because I think we can do a lot more and we can do a lot better. And that's probably where the next shift that we're hoping to see in disability employment and the improvements we want to engender, I think those demand side initiatives could be the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that you touched on there with people feeling more comfortable in saying when they have disabilities as well is, yeah, such a key thing. I think it's good that that's obviously growing. And then I guess on the flip side of that, what do you see are the key benefits of mandatory disability employment and pay gap reporting from the client side of things?
Well, I suppose to pick up from what I was saying previously, we've not really had what I would call demand side policy initiatives in that kind of way. Where we're going, right, employers, we want you to engage with this. This is the mechanism we're going to measure that by, or here's a kind of big dollop of funding that we're going to give to help you address that. It's just not something that we've particularly done in Australia. So I think we need to think through what we want this to look like. From my perspective, I have come to the conclusion that it would be good to ask sort of especially larger employers, a bit like how we do with gender. Obviously, the WGEA asks larger employers every year to report on the percentage of women in the workforce and on the pay gaps. I'm suggesting we basically pick up that model, drag and drop it into the world of disability. They're going to do something similar in the UK, which has sort of come out of some of the work they've been doing there, and the Labour government have got that in an act that's currently going through Parliament. And the big advantage to ask, there are several advantages to this sort of mandatory reporting. The first is it's not a target and it's not a quota. It's not saying you have to do this and there's going to be major consequences if you don't get up to a certain percentage. That's what some countries do, but I don't think it's necessarily the best way to get change or to get buy-in. What it's really saying is that as an employer, this is something that you should be measuring. You should know what percentage of your workforce has disability or discloses of having disability. And you should be thinking about the arrangements that you have in place and whether the pay that you have in place is fair and equitable with people in equivalent roles. That's what that's really saying. And the big advantages that are there, I think the first one is transparency. So, if I'm a consumer and, 22, 23% of Australians have disability, and they have many allies and support networks beyond that. Well, if I want to make consumer choices around which organizations I want to deal with, it would be relevant to me if supermarket A was employing 15% people with disability and therefore reflecting things I care about, and supermarket B was at 2%. So that transparency is important. But beyond that, I think it also gets organizations to engage with the subject. There's lots of talk about DEI right now and all that kind of stuff. And I don't necessarily want to get into that. But what I do want to say is that sometimes disability is the last thing, despite being our largest diversity group, it's the last thing that some employers engage with of that sort of DEI spectrum. And I want to make it not the last thing. So asking employers to say, look, think about how you want to get people in your organization comfortable with the fact they might want to disclose and comfortable with bringing the whole selves to the workplace, and then report on it. Tell us where you're at. Okay, you're at 5%. Well, sure. But some organizations would have no clue what that percentage is. And as we know in business, if you're not measuring, you're not managing. So if you go, oh, actually, we're at 2%, that's a bit low. You know, when you consider Australia's 23%, that's a bit low. Then you might put in place some strategies to deal with that and then monitor it and see where you are next year. Because if you go, you know, 2% is a little low, but if you get to 4% the following year, brilliant. You've doubled the number of people with disability in your workforce. You're engaging, you're making progress. And that's sort of all we can ask. So I think that transparency is really important. I think the other thing around that is actually a bit of normalization. By going, actually, you know what, if I've gone into my workforce and in my head I've made sort of disability employment this hard thing, this difficult thing that we have to engage with, and it's all got all these problems. And then you find out 15% of your staff are disclosing with disabilities, and they go, oh, actually, I'm already doing the things when it comes to disability employment, right? Because they're disclosing, and I already have a staff that has a high percentage of people with disabilities. So transparency and normalization and being able, maybe be able to mobilize some consumer sentiment are all good things. And if you look at the data over pay gaps since 𝐜𝐵 came in, actually, it's really improved. So I think we have a model in Australia already of doing this. And it enables those organizations to know where they're at so they can start working on the problem. So that's where I think of the benefits of the mandatory sort of reporting on people with disability. I think the thing that we need to be careful of, and it does give me pause, is we need to make sure that disclosure is done in the right way in organizations. So they don't just go and sort of forcibly say, right, you have to say you have a disability. Now, that would be a really big, bad result if this were to put this in place. So what we need to do, if you're going to roll something like this out, what you need to make sure is the flip side of that is that we've got a better program of support for employers so they know how to do things like talk to people about disclosure. How if people do disclose something, they know what to do with that information. So there is a sort of, I don't want to say cat and stick because I don't think that's quite the right conceptualization. I think it's more like saying transparency, but if we're going to get to that transparency, we certainly need to make sure that the right support is there in place for employers too. Otherwise, we could have some unintended consequences that we wouldn't want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more on that transparency piece. If you don't know what your stats and figures are, how are you ever supposed to improve on them? So yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And I guess you've touched on it a little bit there, but what are some of the potential risks that could come with the mandatory reporting?
Yeah, I think that is the big one. It's this disclosure risk. So if we're going to unpick that a little bit more, if you look at the statistics right now, the reality is there's lots of businesses, and some of whom might be tuning into this call, who want to do the right thing by people with disability, but don't necessarily know how to do it. You're not taught this in schools, you're not necessarily taught this in MBAs, so you're sort of having to pick it up as you go along. And there's virtue in doing that because that's, you can have innovation by working out as you go along. But on the other hand, if you're going to roll something like this out at scale, that doesn't feel very scalable to me. And the reality is there isn't really anything in the system, I think, for employers where you can definitively say, this is the place you go. There's organizations that are out there doing good work in this space, absolutely, you know, 𝐜𝐮𝐷 and others who you can go to for advice. But in terms of, if I'm, you know, a small to medium business somewhere, and I go, right, I want to go and get this support from somewhere, but I can't necessarily afford it because our margins are tight. Well, what do you do? Do you opt out of getting involved in disability employment, or do you do something more? We do have a disability employment service in place, but really that's actually around the individual that they've got in front of them. So, you know, if one of my members is seeing somebody and they have a caseload of, I don't know, 50 people on their caseload, what they're doing is they're tailoring plans to each of those individual people, and then they might engage with an employer on their behalf, and then they might put a support plan in with that employer, which helps that employer be more inclusive. That isn't the same thing as there being some kind of solution that any employer can access that's going to give them that support to be more inclusive. Job Access and the Employment Assistance Fund, which it manages, is a fund that's there which can help with some things like workplace adjustments. But I think what we need to do better is make it easy for businesses if they want to get involved, if they want to do things like encourage good quality disclosure where people feel psychologically safe, that they've got that information and they know how to do it, and that it's obvious and simple for them to do. So I think those are probably, that is the biggest risk to doing this. I suppose you could also say, some people would argue, oh, it's just another piece of regulation or red tape. Well, yeah, I suppose on one hand it is, but it's a piece of regulation and red tape that if you do it right, is going to help you be a stronger, better business. Because businesses that are diverse and employ people with disability make more profit, have better staff turnover, all those kind of things than those which don't. So I think that downside is somewhat mitigated by the evidence-based data around how disability employment can improve your businesses. It's that kind of psychological safety and disclosure piece, and giving organizations access to the right information and the right support is the kind of flip side of what we're going to have to think about if we're going to do the mandatory disclosure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are so many stats and figures out there that do talk about how the benefits of having a diverse workforce and people with disabilities as well, how can improve your business and culture. So yeah, like I said, so many stats out there that you can look at. I think benefits do seem to outweigh the risks as well. And the next question is actually something that I'm particularly passionate about, and one that I'm constantly trying to strive to educate my clients on as well. But what would you say are some of the biggest misconceptions that employers have about hiring people with disabilities?
Well, I think the first is assuming that people with disabilities is a monolith, right? That, you go, oh, right, it's kind of a crazy thing to go, oh, when 23% of your population have disability, to all say, oh, it's all kind of the same thing. I would never hire someone with disability. Well, really? You have also, would you hire me? Like, because I have a disability? Would you hire someone else who has a physical disability, somebody else who's on the autistic spectrum? You can't put it so easily into a box. So I've occasionally spoken to employees and they said, oh, right, I did try hiring someone with disability once and it didn't work. Well, would you say that about if you hired a man? Oh, I tried hiring a man once and it didn't work. It was too hard. Well, I have hired men and it's not worked out, but I don't necessarily use that to cast aspersions on my entire gender. So treating it as a sort of monolith rather than sort of the panoply of heterogeneous people that we actually are as humans is probably the first mistake that people make. And the sort of subcategory of that is by assuming things like, well, it'd be hard for me to hire someone with disability because I'm in a heritage building, so I can't put ramps in everywhere. Well, only 4% of people with disability are wheelchair users. What about the other 96%? Or actually, can you think around maybe some of the adaptations that you could make that could be funded for people who are wheelchair users? But it is as individual as we are as humans. So I think, most workplace adjustments, for example, are free or extremely cheap, as in under $300 or $200, and many of which can be funded by government anyway through Job Access. So given that point, I think what you need to do, and it sounds obvious, is just treat everyone as individuals. The question that I ask people when I employ them, and it doesn't matter whether they've got a disability or not, is how can I best help you operate at your optimum level? How can we get the best use of you and you therefore get the best use of us, I think. And that can be all sorts of things. So for me, if you ask me that question, it's nothing to do with any disability I have. It's that I have 2 young kids. That's the biggest reasonable adjustment I make, is that I need to pick them up. And, I had to pick up the child from camp this week and had to take one to swimming trials. That helps me operate my best though, because I don't want to be the kind of CEO who doesn't see my kids. And it's the same kind of conversation that you have with anyone when they get in your door is, how can I help you operate your best? So someone with severe anxiety might have a big conversation that you need to have there about their triggers, mitigations, things that you need to do. But it's just the same kind of thing. How can I help you operate at your best? So I think the misconception is around, oh, it's going to be really expensive, it's going to be really complicated, and people with disability are this other thing that I don't know how to deal with. No, people with disability are humans, and you just need to talk to people with disability around what their individual needs are. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception of all, is by treating people with disability as a sort of monolith, as difficult, as expensive, and as complex. Another more simple one would be often say things like, oh, it's going to do something to my insurance premiums. That's really based on nothing. In fact, the people you need to most worry about when it comes to things like insurance and workers' comp are the people who aren't disclosing something to you in your business. If you know about something, then you can deal with it, then you can mitigate it. You have contingencies. If you don't know about something, you're still legally liable and the risk is higher. So there's all sorts of misconceptions that are there. Another one would be around sick days, for example. Oh, people with disability got disability, more sick days. Actually, the data proves the opposite. So quite a few misconceptions in place there, but the biggest of all is by people treating people with disability like they're just one group. It's all the same. It's not. It's as individual as we all are.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think as well, there's such a strong piece on education as well, that people seem to shy away from it because they don't understand it. And I think it's obviously conversations like these that are pushing it out there more and getting people to have those conversations and not shy away from this topic, because yeah, I think there are those misconceptions in place that yeah, obviously you've just answered really well, and I think it just, the more we can spread that, as I said, the more this will all keep snowballing and obviously have hopefully positive impacts. So thank you for joining us today, Peter. If you'd like to learn more about Disability Employment Australia or connect with Peter Bacon and his team to unlock potential together, you can visit www.disabilityemployment.org.au or click the link in the comments.
Always happy to have a chat.
When is the busiest month for your job search in your industry? 𝐝𝐶's latest report used data to highlight times throughout the year when employers across different industries are more likely to be looking for workers and what job seekers are likely to face the most or least competition for roles. So, what are the key takeaways? August is the peak month for job ads on 𝐶, meaning employers face the most competition for talent. However, applications per ad are lower in August, providing job seekers with less competition and more opportunities. January has the highest number of job applications, making the most competitive time for job seekers. Unemployment tends to rise in January, followed by a strong employment rebound in February. May and August are the best months for job seekers, as the job ads are above average, but applications per ad are lower in other months. December is the slowest month for hiring, as job ads drop significantly due to public holidays, making it one of the most challenging times to find work. Younger job seekers, including school leavers and graduates, increase the job search activity in December and January, contributing to a spike in applications. But what about the industries? In sales, it peaks in January and stays high in May. Across healthcare and medical, there is a steady demand year-round. Retail and hospitality has hiring spikes in August and November and then drops off again in December. Education and training peaks in October and has a slow early in the year. Professional services, legal, IT and accounting have least competition in April and May. And that's it for this week's By the Numbers. Are you looking to take the next step of your career? This week's latest job opportunities are presented by a 2025 Market Reports survey. Have your say on the future of work and help us identify salary trends, talent attraction and retention strategies in your industry. Visit peopletopeople.com.au or click the link in the comments to take part. This week we have 4 new job opportunities across Australia. Senior financial accountant based in North Sydney, paying between 50 to 60 per hour. Scheduling coordinator based in Queensland, paying between 31 to 32.56 per hour. An OHS manager based in Adelaide, paying between 110k annually. And a talent acquisition partner based in Bankstown, New South Wales, paying 120 to 125k annually. So if you're looking to grow your career or your team, our teams across New Zealand, Australia and the UK can help. With over 10 offices, including here in Melbourne, we can help you find the job you love and find the right talent for your business to get you back on track in 2025. Reach out to us via our website link in the comments and our teams will come back to you. That's it for today's show. Thank you for joining our market update. We'll be back next week at the same time for the latest information across the Australian employment and job market. See you then.